to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swithin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Natty to discuss men, women, and society in the 21st century. Natty is a home-educating mother of three, anti-feminist, and has had her hand in the men's rights campaigns over the years. So, Natty, what do you think are the major lies society tells to both men and women about their role in society?
Hello, thank you for having me on, first of all. So the major lies, well, I think that the biggest one is that men and women are equal. And I guess when I say equal, I'm using that to say that men and women are the same, or they have the same capacity and the same strengths and weaknesses, and they do not. So I think that's the main one, probably the one that starts everything else off. And I suppose other lies that society tells men and women is that women are overly interested in a career, and even though they tend to go along with this idea when they're younger, or they seem to think it's a good idea when they're very young, like a teenage years or something. But in my experience, and in fact all the evidence and studies have actually demonstrate the fact that they really are not that interested in career over family, over relationships. They're more relationship focused than men are. And I suppose that then leads on to the lie that women can wait until any time in their lives to have children, over the age of 30 to 35 or even later. And I think that one is really coming back to bite everyone in the bum presently. And I suppose those 2 points are focused on women. But, I think that men are also fed the lie that women are capable of the same amount of collective responsibility as men are. And I don't agree with that either. So yeah, I think those are some 3 or 4 points.
What do you mean by collective responsibility in this context?
So there's another YouTuber that I listen to sometimes who stated that women were made with broad hips and men were made with broad shoulders, and shoulders are made for carrying things and carrying a load, whereas hips are there for children to bounce on, basically. And so therefore a woman shouldn't be carrying any kind of load. And I suppose that could mean various things. You've got the physical context mainly, but in terms of having to make decisions about things in a macro way, in politics, or if you're a CEO of a large company, or anything where you have a huge amount of responsibility, I really don't think most women are cut out to do that, personally. And if you'd have spoken to me 10 years ago, I would have said, oh yeah, maybe we just need to give them a bit longer and they'll develop themselves a bit more and they'll be able to. But honestly, now I'm firmly convinced that they're not. Perhaps maybe 5% of them could, but that might even be a stretch.
If most women don't really want a career, etc., why do you think sort of university admissions are primarily female these days? I think even up to masters and possibly even PhD level now.
Yeah.
It would seem to be odd that they would go so high if ultimately that's not what they wanted to do.
Well,
what do you think the dynamic is there?
I think that when in the UK, and I think this is the same for the West in general, but I will talk generally from the UK first because I'm in the UK. But I think it's worse in America. But when you go to school in this country, you're sort of taught that success means going to university, and this is applied to both men and women, and I disagree with that for both men and women. There's for other reasons we could talk about, the fact that they've promoted academia to everyone, and well, they've promoted a version of academia to everyone, but I won't call it academia. Yeah, so I think we have this idea that success means going to university, and if you don't go to university, then you haven't really moved your station in life. You haven't had any social mobility. So it represents social mobility. The other angle, which I don't think is always talked about, I think some people on the internet do. People from the evolutionary psychology angle, that women probably are more attracted to going to university because of, for social mobility, but also because they are hypogamous by nature, and so they want to find a man who is going to be at least the same status as them or higher status, and so going to university is how they do that. And I don't even think that that's not promoted to women in that way, but it's like the underlying message, the underlying context. It's appealing to that base nature of women. I mean, I went to university, and my parents didn't go to university, and it was thought of as an achievement, as you've made it if you go to university, and you would be socializing with a different class of people supposedly if you went to university. And if you're a woman and you think that you're going to eventually marry and have children and a family, then your thoughts will inevitably go to what type of husband you'll want. So I think that they're secretly, or at least not secretly, but the underlying reason is that women saw it as a way to find better husbands, because university was promoted as this thing that everyone should achieve, and especially with New Labour and Tony Blair in this country in particular, which also happened in America as well. But if you're in the UK, you'll know what I'm talking about, because they also made loads of polytechnics universities. So you used to have less universities, and suddenly you had a bunch more. Are you still there?
Yeah. For the American listeners, the polytechnics were the vocational technical colleges.
Yes. Yeah.
And then they decided, oh no, that was degrading. So we'd make them into universities instead. So yeah, that's what Blair did. Blair, if anyone knows, he's sort of like Clinton, but 5 years later, to a large extent.
Yeah.
Just as a general idea of who he is. And just to clarify, people not aware of the term hypergamy. Hypergamy is the idea that women marry up in social status, and sort of the serial hypergamous woman is the one who finds a guy and then always looking for the better one and keeps sort of ascending so they can get to the highest sort of social status they can. The evolutionary argument being that the husband of highest social status and wealth would be the best source of income and protection for her children. That's the broad claim. It is interesting you say about her hypergamy in women, because these days there aren't that many places that you can meet other men or women in either of the cases, because the sort of shared spaces that you would be able to meet people in are somewhat diminished. Especially what, sorry?
Especially these days.
Well, yes, exactly. I mean, far from ideal meeting people in the pub in general, but in many cases, but that was a place where you could meet people. Now you don't go. I mean, another thing is I work from home all the time now. I don't really have any work colleagues. I just do my own thing. So if I was single, I wouldn't. Well, I suppose I'd go out more and go to places and things. But it is quite difficult. And online, Online dating, I have no idea how it works. Well, I do. I haven't done it. At least not I told my wife. It's a joke, by the way, anybody. Is that it's actually kind of better to meet people in reality, especially for men, actually, because men do terribly on online dating sites from what I've read in general. So actually having like a space where you can actually meet people is kind of probably useful. Now, I suppose you could say, well, you could do that in schools, but again, the hypergamy and stuff, it's so self-selecting because you go to a good university, you're going to have a higher class man there. You would hope, but whether or not that is the case is another question. I mean, it's interesting with schools in general. I've had some tutees, and they were at a girls' grammar school, and they were constantly beaten over the head with STEM, with science, technology, engineering, and maths.
Yeah.
Which they were just like, they had a zero interest in at all. And the interesting is, one of them did A-level maths, but like, no, we don't have really any interest in going into these careers at all. But it was just sort of a beaten over the heads that that's something that they should do. It's also interesting that, in my experience, that nobody knows anything about fertility over time. Because I remember when I was in schools, colleges, I did when I had a bit of time extra, like what was it called, tutorial time or whatever. I did something. Where do you want to be when you're 40? Was it 40 or was it 30? It was 30 or 40. I can't remember which. I think it was 40. And I was saying, like, most of you probably be married at some point in your life, typically. And then I put figures for like fertility rates and things. I remember the girls thinking, oh, I didn't expect it to be that bad over the age of 30 or like late 20s. And it's like, yep, that's reality. But reality is hidden from you. And so, yeah, I don't think anybody had ever really spoken about that to them. So it's just not really joined up. But moving on a little bit. Stefan Molyneux, a guy I used to listen to quite a bit. I haven't really listened to him that much recently. He's a bit repetitive, I think, these days. But one of the interesting he highlighted was the idea that men propose and women dispose. And he highlighted quite a bit that actually women have quite a lot of control over their life, but tend not to be held accountable for those decisions. So if a woman decides to get the hunky guy and get knocked up by him, and he just decides, he can't be bothered with the baby, just leaves, then all the blame is on him rather than for her from engaging in sort of sexual relations with a guy. She had pretty much had a good idea. Well, he was just good looking, but that was about it. And so they tend to be absolved of responsibility in those situations. As well, typically, I believe this is the case, except in some circumstances, but women in general receive lighter prison sentences than men for similar offences, although I do think it is the case in some instances that they get harsher sentences, but I think that's more of a minority case, and I think probably to do with cruelty to children.
Yes, that's right.
I think is the one. But in general, women have lower have lighter sentences, etc., and generally aren't really sort of held accountable in the same way men are. So would you agree that is the case? And how can society as a whole treat women in such a way to recognise their actual agency?
So yes, I very much agree. And one of the reasons I became interested and I got involved was because when I went to university and I studied feminism in more depth than just the stuff that they was feeding you in society and school in general. I remember learning about Susan Faludi, the way objectification theory, and how women are reduced down to body parts in films, in a film studies class, because I did the most Mickey Mouse degree ever, and I'm sure you can guess what I did. and I remember thinking, but women that I know, they like the attention they get from men, and they deliberately wear certain things and act a certain way so they get it, and they like men to look at them, and they don't like the unattractive men to look at them, but they generally want men to look at them overall, right? And they want to be noticed, they want to be desired. And I remember thinking that this was a decision that women made themselves, and this was not forced upon them in society. And that was one of the first thoughts I had, where I started to question what was being fed to me at university quite deeply. And so that kind of led on to, after some years of me just completely rejecting the feminist term and label, I still believe some of the myths that was fed to me, but I completely rejected it. And it was because I realized that women were not held accountable at all, especially in things like domestic violence. And I'd had a lot of experience in my own personal life, and just that really made me look at it, opened my eyes, because I knew that most cases of domestic violence are reciprocal, which is where both the man and the woman are abusing each other, and the roles can change. Sometimes the man is more abusive and sometimes the woman is. The kind of dependent and codependent dynamic that is usually promoted in the media is actually not the trend. That's the exception. The rule is generally two dysfunctional people who like to use violence. And also the other data that's collected about it is that most of the time the women start the fight and men end it. So they'll have an argument. The woman might, push the man, throw something at him. Usually a woman will use a weapon rather than her fist. And then eventually he'll take it for a while, and then he will lose his temper and then give her a punch or a slap or something, and then maybe leave the house and it'll all be done. Yeah. But usually it's the woman that initiates the fight. And I remember just being absolutely appalled that no one seemed to hold women responsible for their part in a situation like that, for example. And I think one of the recent examples that reminded me of this even more, was Caroline Flack. So if you're in America or somewhere else in the world, you should Google, or don't use Google, use some other search engine, but Caroline Flack. So she's like a TV presenter. She was on Love Island in the UK. And she's clearly had some kind of personality disorder or something, because she had unhinged, erratic behaviour, and she attacked her boyfriend in the middle of the night with a lamp. And there's pictures of the scene afterwards with blood all over the beds. And she basically assaulted him and could have probably killed him. And he took her back because he's in that type of relationship where he feels he's under her thrall, as it were. And she picked it felt like the whole of the UK felt sorry for her, because what happened was she got arrested, and the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, said they were going to prosecute her, even though the boyfriend didn't really want to. But what's actually happened with the CPS, and this is a whole other point I can bring up, I won't go into detail now, is about how domestic violence against men has gone up, and it's actually gone up so much that they are being forced to acknowledge it more with the services that are provided, because there are currently there are no services. I could tell you there are 15, last time I checked, there was 15 places that men could go if they needed to escape domestic violence and leave their home, for example. And there are only a handful of men's charities that provide services to men. The other domestic violence charities that provide help for victims they say that they're gender neutral, but what happens when a man calls them is they screen the man as a potential abuser, because they have a model where they view the man as the abuser. And so anyway, so what's happened is the CPS have actually been getting a lot of heat about it, and they decided to make this case as an example, and they said, we're going to prosecute because we have to, because this man's a domestic violence victim, we can't let her go away with it. And the reaction was just utter. I was really just so irritated by the whole thing, because she was reported a lot in the tabloids, and she got a lot of flack on social media, and she got a lot of attention, and then she killed herself. Okay. And basically everyone was saying that it was because she was hounded by the media and unfairly prosecuted by the CPS. And I was just, I remember talking to a few sort of normie ladies, the term normie, just ladies that I know who I don't talk about any of this stuff with generally, but they all watched Love Island, so I did bring it up, and I said, look, if it was a man, would you have felt sorry for her, or would you be like, good, he killed himself because he felt guilty, and oh well. And they claimed that they would have the same amount of sympathy, and I said, I really don't believe that for 1 second, that you would have the same amount of sympathy. And so I've gone off on a story as a recent example here, which I'm sorry, but I think that what's happened with all the development with human development, the Industrial Revolution, and now the tech revolution that we're at now, I think that men and women are still biologically suited to living in a hunter-gatherer society, or maybe even a bit further after that, and we really haven't changed enough to become where men and women have the same amount of agency, equal. And I think that there are exceptions. Some individuals, some women can take on more agency than you would expect, and I sort of mentioned that earlier, but they are the exceptions in my opinion. I just think that we want to, because we're quite a gynocentric species, we just want to protect women so much that any kind of mental fragility that a woman shows, it's just like she has to stay alive, she has to stay, we have to keep her protected so much, because she is the limiting factor in reproduction, and men are more disposable, and we still have not got rid of that as much as we'd have supposedly advanced, and I really just don't see it. Well, I do see it changing, and that's a whole other conversation, but it's not changing organically, let's put it that way. I think I've spoken enough now. You can respond.
It's funny you were talking about Caroline Flack, because I was googling her to remind myself, because I was going to bring it up if you didn't.
Okay. I think very, very the perfect example of a woman not being held accountable.
Although I remember that CPS's change in policy slightly differently, because I thought they prosecuted people for domestic violence because they thought too many women didn't want to prosecute their boyfriend or husband. But they need to do it. So it was actually the feminist policy that they kind of felt like, oh, well, we put this in because of, well, we got to go into domestic violence, because domestic violence must be a lot bigger than anyone says it is. Because that's always one of my things I come across with the feminists is, oh, domestic violence is this figure, but actually we really know that it's like 1 million times higher or worse. That tends to be, well, that may or may not be true, but
it is worse. It's worse against men.
Yeah.
I know I've got plenty of sources to prove that. For example, parental alienation is generally an extension of continued domestic violence against men, and there has been a campaign which Philip Davies tried to promote, and he's probably one of the only MPs who's ever tried to do anything for men in the UK. And And he tried to be fair, there was a couple of other people that supported it, but he was the one pushing it. And they tried to change the definition. And if that definition was changed, then the official cases of domestic violence against men would absolutely skyrocket in this country.
I'm not surprised, but it was the generally feminist campaign to always prosecute domestic violence, which is what basically hamstrung the CPS to actually prosecute.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Sorry, was that even though, so you're quite right. It was the feminists that pushed for the CPS to get that policy. But what's been happening, and this is a whole nother conversation we can have. But what's been happening is there's been a campaigns which I have sort of been involved in, but not on a serious level. But I have been around observing some very hard-working activists who've been putting heat on the CPS and the government about this stuff for years. They've basically been saying, look, you need to take the gender stuff. The Gender Equality Act is discriminating against men, basically, and we need to sort that out, and men need support too, blah, blah, blah. And they have been getting a lot of heat. And actually the heat has been coming from the trans lobby, because the trans lobby are saying, well, you know, you got to let trans men into refuges, and you need to include them. And so they even though that was designed for women, the language used is gender neutral, although it's filtered through the Gender Equality Act, which is not gender neutral. It's all very complicated, sort of. So they did do that as a response, because it was so the story of her, the evidence that was, because the Sun published all those pictures of his bedroom and stuff. It was so outrageous that they couldn't just go, oh, she'll just get off on a slap of the wrist and, you know, a warning. They couldn't. They had to say, right, we've got this policy, we have to push it, because it was pretty bad what she did. Yeah. So and so it just, the amount of sympathy that she got was just, it was disturbing. I found it disturbing anyway. I got into quite a few arguments about it with people, because I said to them that women with borderline personality disorder often will try to kill themselves to absolve themselves of accountability. And perhaps she did that and she just succeeded, because generally when women kill themselves, they don't succeed. Men's suicide rate is like 3 times as higher as women, and it's because they generally succeed when they do it. When they do it, they're actually going to do it, and women just do it for attention.
I'm going to cut in here. I'm relatively suspicious of the state child protection services, what they would be called here in the United States, the right to take children away, or the right in family law in general with respect to. And I very much appreciate the men's rights activists. Okay, so first I want to state that I very much appreciate that. As far as I want to circle back to the sort of beginning the discussion here with more respect to men versus women. Tyler Cowen made a comment. Well, he's like a sort of mainstream, once was a libertarian, now is more like he's taken the traditional and become a social democrat of some kind. One said a comment, which I think is 100% true. And it mirrors what Miley Yiannopoulos says, and it mirrors my own personal observation, that women do quite well in late industrial, whatever you want to call the society that Britain and the United States has. They fill most of the high honor positions in colleges. They get. I think there's a study the Cato Institute put out a while back that actually found that women on average make more. Women under 32 or something like that make more money than men, which means. And if I was a corporate boss, and I actually sort of in a way experienced this, I would hire women. They're much more agreeable. They probably work harder. They take better orders. They're perfect for late modern industrial, not in labor, since labor is largely gone. It's all done by machines. And the only jobs that have are like cottage industries, like fishing or something like that, which aren't most fish would be farmed in a tank in some place, and from my understanding anyway. And farming is all done with computerized tractors, and they're getting that way. So have women just moved? To me, I'm always sort of sympathetic to sort of materialist explanation, although I'm not a materialist. Have women just done better at the game lately in terms of education, in terms of schooling, in terms of all sorts of bureaucracies? If you they're quite good at climbing bureaucracies. And actually, in Northern European countries, most of the governments, I'd argue, are probably, I think the entire government of Sweden or Norway is all women. They're not a single man in high positions. And I think the West in general is trending that way. Are women better at late industrial capitalism? I'm going to sort of play devil's advocate in a certain way for them. I mean, this is probably the strongest argument you could posit towards them, and that's not necessarily a good thing necessarily, because even the Marxist Slavoj Zizek was making fun of judges in European Union trials or something like that, sentencing young boys to prison who oftentimes are black. This also occurs in New York City and other sort of liberal cities as well. So have women, restate the question, have women just done better in the sort of current game? And we want to change the game. What would be the if that statement is true, Natty?
Okay, there's a lot. There's so much I could say about here. I think I've got various points going through my head with that. With this, I guess the first thing I said was the first thing I thought was, okay, how are we defining capitalism? But let's not go there. So I was trying to make a joke. But yeah, I think you said that women are so the fact that they are doing better would be demonstrated by the fact that they're in these high level jobs and they're running governments. But I suppose we're forgetting to mention that a lot of the reason they're there is because of positive discrimination and gender quotas. So my argument back would be that the only real reason why most of them are there is because it's been made easy for them to get there. So we have these quotas where we need more women in certain CEO corporate positions. The government actively has these goals, and even before it was put into governmental policy, it was promoted on a cultural level, and and university admissions. And as Swiffen mentioned earlier with STEM, they've really been trying so hard to lower the standards so that women can fill more, up to 50% of particular positions and stuff. And I don't, this is me not saying that women overall are not as smart as men, because we know the bell curve stuff that most women are in the middle and most men are in the middle too. So it's not even that from a kind of intelligence level, but they just have different motivations to men, which you sort of discussed earlier. I think that if you're a woman who just wants to achieve career success, you want to get to a certain point, a certain level, earn a certain amount of money and have a certain amount of status, then I guess, yeah, you're winning, and overall your group is winning. But as I mentioned earlier, the majority of women actually do not see that as success. They are propagandized into believing that is what they should be doing, because we have this whole feminist narrative going back from before the 60s, where women needed to make up for all this time where they were horribly oppressed, and therefore they have to it's like they're getting revenge, and they're finally on top now. As you know, we've fed that stuff all the time, all day, every day in mainstream culture. But so they sort of fall for it in the beginning. But, you know, you don't even, I mean, we actually have studies that demonstrate that women are family focused and relationship focused compared to career focused, and they're only about 10 to 15% of career focused. And I actually think that's even too high. I think it's less than that personally. But yeah, so if the fact that they are, you know, winning this game, the fact that they're in those positions, well, what game are they playing? Because if most of them are really not actually that happy with the game, as it were, because really they'd be far more satisfied or happier if they were married to a higher status man, and they had a house full of 2 or 3 kids, or maybe more, but let's just say these days everyone has 2 or 3 kids, or less actually, but they got set, okay, let's just say 2 kids, they have a higher status husband, and they work part-time on some small little business, maybe like a mum what's that term, entrepreneur it's called, business, where they have this little part-time work from home thing, or it might be out of the home. That is kind of the ideal scenario for the majority of women, honestly. Like 90% of them would be absolutely ecstatic to have that. Women just don't generally want to be the provider. They want to work, they want to sort of be you know, they want influence and they want power, but they don't want to be the provider. They still want the man to be the provider, even though, you know, and they don't seem to have reconciled the fact that the two have to come together generally. So, and if they don't come together, then they're going to be 50-50 with their man, their husband. But yeah, so I guess to summarize my point really is that that I don't think most women are happy in those types of roles, and I think that well, basically a lot of women have got to those roles because they've had a kind of cheat sheet. We've had governmental policy pushing them into it, and if that policy didn't exist, they wouldn't be there. And we kind of are going to face a huge backlash and trade-off very soon, because you know you can't cheat the system forever.
I would agree. In some extent, I'm partly playing devil's advocate here. Partly, I would agree that the system has been, you know, they've been hounded towards getting, you know, Swithin was pointing out, students. There've been these sort of formal policy goals to get people in there. But I do think, you know, as a person who used to work for a Fortune 500 company in a very middle to low role, I view the job as basically alienating in a certain way. I have a habit of agreeing in certain ways with the Marxist claims. Now, whether or not that's just capitalism is sort of a question you could spend. Robert Nozick, Murray Rothbard. You could spend 10 years debating that topic.
Yeah.
I'm a Wittgensteinian when it comes to words. I basically think that if words have standard use, we have to sort of use them as such. You can have sort of private technical definitions if you want, but at some point that just becomes kind of meaningless private dialogue. So in my experience, you know, I mean, I think 4/5 or 3/4 my professors in university were women, for example, and like, you know, in high school and middle school, I think it was probably 7 or 8/10 were women. Almost all my bosses in the jobs I've worked were women. And so, like, in my sort of empirical personal reality, women have dominated society here in the United States. I'm willing to sort of concede the game's rigged, but I also think that late industrialism, for better or for worse, is a kind of alienated society. As you pointed out, with hunter-gatherers, it's not a particularly enjoyable society. One of the interesting things that we have in the United States, which Europe doesn't really have, is we have this is actually, Milo Yiannopoulos is good at being controversial, although he might be working for the feds anyway. He still makes good points. You have a huge amount of males, in particular black males in prison, but white males increasingly too. That's one thing if you bring up a gender disparity that goes the other way. The very top is occupied by men, but all these sort of middle of the pyramids occupied by women, and the bottom of the pyramid mostly occupied men. If you should have a pyramid of class, so the top still, the George Soroses, the Elon Musk, the Harvey the Weinsteins, the Jeffrey Epsteins, those are the top of the pyramid. But the middle, that middle might not have existed historically because of how much labor is just necessary. What do you think the prospects going forward are to this? I mean, you can always try to change the schooling system, deschooling, homeschooling, and I entirely agree. I entirely agree with that. Local, parochial, small change. Some people treat this as lifestyle anarchism in a way. I entirely agree with that. But the school districts and large corporations and governments, I mean, I sort of view them as lost causes in a certain extent going forward. Maybe that's overly pessimistic outcome. But what do you think the prospects going forward are for the gender relations? I mean, for one thing, demographic collapse might bring about things. I don't know if you've ever read the book The Fundamentals Shall Inherit the Earth, and that's possibly true. The only people who have children are like fundamentalists, Christians, and Islam, Muslims. So that can always just sort of, in certain counties in the United States, the only people that count for growth are Amish, and certain counties in Europe, I think, are all the Muslims. I think that's basically true. It might not be true everywhere. So what do you think the sort of outcomes for this sort of, whatever you want to describe the current thing going forward? Maybe we can sort of pass around memes and complain about the home services and stuff like that. And I entirely agree. I think it's wretched and wicked, but I would in general take this sort of anarchist position, just sort of, the state courts are going to be sort of phony to begin with. You're dealing with a kangaroo court, in particular for men. What would you make of that, Natty? Are you pessimistic?
Okay, pessimistic about the future? Is that what you're saying? Is that
yes. Unless you mean like that certain religious groups will just have like the only growth in that way, then you shouldn't be pessimistic. But otherwise, the sort of formal society, I'm quite pessimistic about.
I think what we're getting to here is I wrote this like massive posts on Facebook recently because I was responding to something that has been brewing in my own circles, which was a question that Swithin actually has wrote in beforehand, which is to do with the dissident right and technocracy. I think your question is probably leading to that already, but I don't know if you anyway. But so yes, I am pessimist. I am not optimistic at all. I have taken the black pill. I mean, I'm trying to be a Christian, and I mean, I've always believed in God, but more recently, I am actually trying to be practicing Christian, and so I've got to start incorporating the Christian worldview a little bit more, even though So, but in terms of our immediate future, in terms of men and women to get, I don't have. I'm not optimistic, really. I think we're going to continue the trends that are currently happening with men becoming the lower class men, as you kindly pointed out, with the triangle, which is the perfect representation of what's happened with the small section of men at the top, women in the middle, and all the other men at the bottom. That's exactly what's going on. And it's really interesting because you were saying before that women are, maybe you're playing devil's advocate, and women are playing the game better than lower class men, I guess, or other men. But really, they're not because they're not really in control, because they're still if the feminists and women who are careerists think that they are suddenly, running everything and they have power, they have some power in the sense that they have voting power, because we have to still have some democracy, but and they're easily kind of molded, but they are still not the ones running things, as you pointed out, I guess. I mean, in some ways, we could talk about what the influence of people like George Soros' wife might be, but that would be pure speculation, because I don't really know anything about his wife. But I suppose the point I'm making here is that often when you have a very powerful man who is part of the kind of powers that be controlling things, trying to be Mr. King Globalist or whatever, then often you do have a wife alongside him. But I mean, Bill Gates got rid of his wife recently, and Elon Musk has had a couple, and now he's with Grimes, who's thinks that we should have AI controlled communism. She's clearly absolutely nuts. So really, maybe in their cases, the wives are not really that influential at all. I mean, I don't think you can influence an autistic guy of that level, personally. But yeah. But generally, I would have said that, a married couple there would be an influence from a woman in the man's life of that level. I'm going off on a tangent here, sorry. But I think that we're just going to continue to see more men stepping out of society, and millennials have been, and lower than millennials have been, constantly being fed this propaganda that they shouldn't reproduce, and that having a family in the family unit is somehow oppressive or archaic, and they're not really going to get their kind of content and satisfaction by having a family, and that is going to reach peak soon. And that makes me kind of sad, but I just don't see. I think we're just going to reach the bottom. I don't know when the bottom's going to happen, because I'm sure there's various other scholared people that have made the predictions, but I can see it reaching peak in our lifetime, I think. Does that answer your question? I think there's more to discuss here, but I don't want to keep warbling on, because I think I need one of you guys to jump in and move it along.
No, Swithin, if you want to continue, please. That's great.
I think Tim's point with the men on top, women in the middle, and men on the bottom actually is something that more traditional societies have, polygamy, which is why possibly the wives of these rich men are possibly not as influential as they would have been, certainly in the 19th century or earlier. Rich men could divorce their wives, but it's significantly more difficult than it is today. So it just seems to be going to a more sort of polygamous society, which then really does accentuate sort of the big man on top, with these veritable harem where most men on the bottom don't have any wives, which of course gives the men on top significantly more power than they would do if they were sort of monogamous. On the general trends for the future, I think I would be generally pessimistic. I think I'm always pessimistic in the medium term, but more optimistic in the long term. But certainly nothing is particularly going in a good direction at present. I think I'm tempted with the fundamentalists will inherit the earth thesis. I do think there is some element of truth at that, although the large Muslim population in England could well make that somewhat of a problem in certain instances. So that's.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so this is what I was talking about when we spoke about the dissident right and their treatment of women, and their attitudes, and the fact that people who are very enthusiastic about Moldbug and neo-reactionary thought, there's a there's a kind of contingent that are very happy to see women basically have all their agency stripped, and the little agency they do actually have. But and really, I think that we might see. So the two things going on here was what I was talking about before, is that we have this movement towards transhumanism going on, right? So people like Elon Musk, perfect example, and his new wife Grimes, who is like a transhumanist nutcase. And I actually like some of her songs. I think they're quite catchy. But if you look at her whole aesthetic and what she talks about and everything about her and him, his granddad was a part of technocracy from its origins. They really are like enthusiastic transhumanists, and ultimately the goal is to get rid of gender and to move past human reproduction as it is now. So why that links with the dissident right for me is what I was talking about before, is that there is a kind of contingent of sort of discussion online that are saying that we can use this kind of technocracy model of running society to bring back traditionalism, but we'll have it in a kind of tech, post-industrialist way, and we'll be able to take over from the horrible Marxists and progressives, and as long as we're running it, everything will be fine. That whole thing, but the attitude towards women is that basically women will just become property again. But it's a questionable as to whether women were ever really property in the West anyway. So I don't know why they seem to think that they really were. Women are being bought by men. That's kind of true. But when they say women are property or should be thought of as in that way, it's not the same thing. Anyway, so what I was going to get to here is I sort of predicted that, I was speculating that this plan to go towards this ridiculous gender-free transhumanist utopia, I think it will fail. They're trying their best to get there, but I think it will fail. And ultimately, and what we probably will have is the Handmaid's Tale. And I don't want to say that that's exactly what's going to happen, because some people will say, oh no, that's a bit reactionary, dramatic, or whatever. But if you've read the book, or I haven't actually read the book, but a friend of mine read it and she gave me a very detailed review of it, and I've watched some of the TV show. But in that world, there was a strong fundamentalist reaction to neoliberalism and a liberal society that's reached its degenerate endpoint, I guess. And also there was a demographic problem. So, the poor women had to become the incubators for the rich, and also the poorer men, the lower class men, were sort of given roles again, but not necessarily wives. So to me, I think once this technocracy takeover fails, then we're going to have the Handmaid's Tale, and it might be via Islam, like you just mentioned, which is why I wanted to jump in, because I don't see it being via Christianity personally. I think it's more likely to be Islam, which would be the religious component of it.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because Peter Hitchens' interpretation of the book is actually inspired by Islam, not Christianity. And actually, he claims that the TV show basically says it's Christianity, but actually Margaret Atwood was really looking forward to a more of an Islamic dominated one. Because one of the interesting things is with property of women is obviously in Christianity, polygamy is prohibited. And so by that sense, the status of the wife is necessarily higher. Well, assuming it's not serial monogamy.
Islam, women is not property either. That's a mistake.
No. I wasn't saying that. What I meant was they would have less influence. Well, most general statement is Islam is polygamous, and in polygamous societies, women typically have less influence than they do comparatively with monogamous one. That's all my claim.
Yeah.
How? So
let me cut in here. You spoke about definitions, and I oftentimes think definitions have. That's actually one of the things that me and Swithin met on is a discussion on definitions. Is would you say the current world is? In some ways, it sounds laughable. In some ways, it doesn't sound laughable. Would you say the current world is feminist at its core? Because on the one hand, you have the sort of real, if there is a ruling class, what I think there is, that's 99. The true ruling class is 99% male. But the managerial class, on the other hand, is probably like 80%. You read like Burnham's Managerial Revolution and things like that, and which comes from Weberian, which sort of comes out of Weberian capitalism. What do you think Weber's right, or whatever? The Managerial Revolution is true. I think empirically it's probably true. You have that. Those people, they rule, and they also rule other women too, to a large extent. The universities, the corporations, and Northern Europe is sort of the model that the United States probably will take in 30 years. In Britain, it's probably almost there. We're getting closer to there. So would you say the current society is, air quote, feminist? I mean, because you make the one argument, you say, no, they're not yet in there. Although people like Hillary Clinton are trying. But on the other hand, it's like that. So I sort of have to laugh. In some ways, I have to laugh when the whole Jeffrey Epstein thing came out, which I just sort of, that just made me. It sounds somewhat sadistic in a sense, but on the other side, it's like, has anything really changed since the Anchian regime? What would you make of that, Natty? Speaking of definitions, in the middle, I think it's clearly feminized. But what would you say?
Define feminism, which is great. So is current society feminist? So feminism's definition is the belief that men have and currently do oppress women, and have done for, well, there's two streams of thought about it. That it's the last 100 years, or at least from the turn of the beginning of the 1900s, or just after the Industrial Revolution. Because before then, apparently they weren't oppressed. But then the other stream of thought is that they've always been oppressed by men, and that's the more radical side of it. Because there's lots of rad femmes that are kind of into this whole women are basically oppressed by their biology, and they'll say it's men, but when you actually discuss it with them, they really just have a problem with women's biology. But that's a whole nother that's another conversation. But yeah, so if the definition is that women are oppressed by men, and men are part of the patriarchy, and the patriarchy are the elite, the top 1% of men, and so the definition is that the belief is that men buy into the patriarchy, and therefore they're oppressed by the patriarchy too, but they still buy into it because it's like a carrot and stick thing for them. The patriarchy here you go, lower class man, here you go, here's a bit of carrot, follow the carrot around. You can become like me if you do this, this, and this, and they get rewarded for following the patriarchy. And that would be a kind of more intelligent feminists argument. The kind of bog standard lower woman who says she's feminist doesn't really know anything about feminist theory and is just kind of following whatever. She'll just say that all men oppress women in general and won't really know the kind of more nuance about the theory. I would say that most men, I don't know, where am I going here? I would say that most men do not benefit from the patriarchy. If we're just saying that the patriarchy are the top 1% of men who are, these puppet master types, I don't believe that they are benefiting at all. So if this is you asking if the feminist theory is correct, and or if women have won through feminism, have they won? Have they become powerful? Is everything, have they become if it's more, then that, well, we've sort of agreed they haven't really, and that men don't really benefit from the patriarchy, if that's how you're defining them, and they never really did. So I guess society is feminist in so many ways, but yeah, I've lost my train of thought here, but
no, I want to stress the stuff you were saying about like abuse and those points I entirely agree with. The stuff the school points I entirely agree with. The general insight they have I entirely agree, both firsthand and empirically, and that all those points I agree with. But on sort of more meta level, at times, at times I think of myself as playing devil's advocate, but at times I think, on the other hand, what has changed, and that's actually a sort of, that's in a way a sort of, an optimistic tone, that it's actually not as bad as we stated. That's you get so far down the pessimism that the only place to go is up. That this might not be a bumper sticker, but on the other hand, I'm full advocate of what the guy, he used to be a left-wing anarchist, then became a libertarian. He calls it lifestyle anarchist. I'm full advocate of that. Homeschooling, anything of that degree, people dropping out of society to the best of their ability. And actually, the Amish themselves are an interesting group that did this very well. And other groups have done this very well. And it's worth pointing out the fact that the ISIS, Muslim Brotherhood, or Taliban won against the most advanced military on earth for like beat them in 18 Mirror War, and only 30 years ago beat the second most one, the Soviet Union, I think is quite an interesting going forward. I mean, the sort of Eurasian landmass going forward. So those are I appreciate what you do and everything, but on a meta level, it remains complicated. You even sort of brushed away at The Handmaid's Tale, which I think is somewhat funny. You also got another book like 50 Shades of Grey, which is another funny book that sort of appeared. Jordan Peterson was making fun of the fact that this book was popular. Jordan Peterson Jordan Peterson has problems. The book has problems, but I think the correct point that this book has an audience in a society that claims to be feminist is laughable, because you have like Ubermensch par excellence identified in the protagonist there, from my understanding. So I do think if you sort of look at more abstract levels, things being on the micro level, I agree with you. Swithin, do you have any comments on what we've been talking about? And give me a chance to catch my breath here.
No, I would say that society is sort of broadly feminist, at least in what it believes about itself. But ultimately, feminism as sort of an ideology is impossible. Mm-hmm. I think that's what we've got, and I think the choice really is, I think, primarily between the monogamous and polygamous society, really. And actually, as it were, the polygamous society is much more inegalitarian than the monogamous society, given the concentration of power and wealth and women that the big man can get, which is actually ironic considering a lot of the feminist movement comes out of Marxism. So I do think that's somewhat ironic. But that would be my take. Is feminism is actually impossible, but it still doesn't stop people from believing it and taking a lot of people down with belief, which seems to be the current situation.
I think that you guys are, I guess what you're saying, you're accepting the kind of feminist marketing that we could have a 50-50 equal society, and women could be in control and in power. But when you ask feminists who are feminist campaigners what their end goal is, for example, the Women's Equality Party in the UK, they have actually explicitly numerous times said we don't have an end goal. They've never claimed an end goal. They've never said this question has been asked to them before, because I used to follow them quite closely, because we tried to debate Sophie Walker, or whatever her name was, numerous times when I was with the Liberty Bells, and I tried to debate her in person once, and she just like tried to run away from me. But like, they have explicitly said we don't have an end goal, because numerous times people said to them, at what point in society will we have reached peak feminism? Will women be equal to men? We won't be oppressed anymore? And they refuse to define it. So they know that it is a fraud inherently, I believe, and they know that it's just a way of gaining as much power as possible. And it's all kind of nudge, wink, wink in some ways. Although you do have the radical feminists who do seem to have legitimate psychological problems when you talk to them in person. I actually feel sorry for them, honestly. But yeah, and also the TERFs are right about the tranny stuff in some ways. But yeah, that's a side point. But yeah, so, I think they kind of know. The ones who are doing the serious campaigning work, they kind of know that it is impossible to reach this kind of, because the goal has always been vague and in the first place, and it's because, well, they weren't. I personally believe that feminism was never an ideology that was supposed to be taken particularly seriously with an end goal. It was just used as a vehicle to get to a certain point for technocracy and globalism. That's just my opinion.
I do think the stated lack of goal of the Women's Equality Party is similar with the left in general, but it seems just a recipe for permanent revolution without any idea of when we are actually there. Similar to the sort of even the radical left, like, well, what will society look like when the revolution is genuinely taking place? They don't know. They just know they have to be against things, and it's ultimately a negative ideology.
Well, the end goal is in my opinion, is to remove gender completely, and for us to become kind of these kind of weird androgynous drones. And I know that sounds all very dramatic and sci-fi like, but that is kind of the end goal. But they don't want to say that, because the feminists, the progressive leftists are kind of the useful idiots to move towards that being as an accepted goal in society. And we already have it with all the trans stuff, and then all of the AI, and then even MGTOW's being pushed towards that, because there's quite a lot of this kind of idea that we should be happy about artificial wombs, because it will remove women's monopolizing their control, their monopoly over reproduction, for example.
I want to cut in here. There's always an on-running contradiction here, which can be solved in theory, but probably never implemented in practice. And the Quakers have probably done it. The Quakers have probably, in theory, have done it the best. The first group to probably put women's in some sort of now they wouldn't call it leadership, but you have to put. I'm putting air quotes here. Is the Quakers, of course. And the Quakers did this, but they called themselves the Society of Friends, where everyone was an equal. So if you had the George Fox's wife, of course, would read whatever sermon or so forth in there, and they were the first group to really do this with a capital D. And some people could probably find some group in the early church of the 6th century that did this, but in general, they were the first group to do this. And again, the best Marxists are sort of dissident Protestants, certain random Protestant groups. I think the Oneida Christians were the first to have egalitarian marriage. And the Quakers also the first to have egalitarian marriages as well. So if you want to straw man the Marxists, it's always good, in my opinion, to find some Protestant sect. And in that you can find the best role, because then you also get the teleology out of it too, which the Marxists generally get rid of. So if I were to strawman the left, and the left always has a problem when it gets power, because you need to implement the revolution. This is where the whole vanguardism thing comes up. What are we doing? We're doing a revolution in the name of the people. Aren't we part of the bourgeois ruling class ourselves? Engels and Lenin are like the richest, comes from like one of the richest families in, I think, Vienna or Switzerland. So those are to me sort of the always contradiction there, sort of their outlook. But Swithin or Natty, if you want to sort of comment on that, I think we should wrap this up. This is going on for quite some time. So,
Natty, any comments on what Tim just said?
Yeah, no, you go ahead, and I'll go after you.
Oh, okay. Oh, I was going to switch gears slightly. Just on the last you've mentioned before. The right in general, the libertarian dissident right, whatever, is much more male focused than the left, even though the left politically is still primarily male, because politics is primarily male. What do you think the right and libertarian right can do to be, I don't say women friendly, as in you have a positive sort of outreach program? But is there anything you think, in your experience, that they do that dissuades women from being involved or a part of the movement, which would make them more attractive to society as a whole, rather than just being seen as a bunch of autistes?
Sorry, I got handed the baby, so
That's fine.
So as someone who got interested in libertarianism, I mean, I've got a whole story about that to do with my family history, but put that aside, and then also I've been sort of listening to the dissident right for the last few years, and I've got friends that are interested in it and discuss it and whatever, and most of them are male, and in fact the only females that are interested in it really are like autistic, so I don't really understand what I'm doing here, because I'm autistic. But yeah, so I think that the kind of autistic, sorry to keep using that term, level of abstract debate about free market theory or whatever else, that really puts women off, because women generally are a little bit more practical. They want to talk about how is this going to be implemented in their everyday life, because women, well, as you've correctly pointed out, they're not necessarily going to be the one who is responsible for everything, because they're not going to be that top 1% male leader, and also women's role really, their sphere of influence in society is children, and that if they're going to have a husband and a family and multiple children, they are molding the children every day, and so therefore their sort of influence is on that level, on the domestic level, on the level of building children and building their minds and building their characters. And I think that if you're going to appeal to women, then you should appeal to their maternal sensibilities, really, even the ones that claim to be all into career and all that, they still tend to drift or they're interested in things from that angle, and so I think Molyneux did a very good thing. He achieved the correct he had the right idea when he started doing his call-in shows, and then therefore if the women are listening to the call-in shows, then they start listening to his theories about other things, right? And so I would say that because women are focused on relationships and how if they're focused on how they are building children and their characters and their psychology, then that's why they're going to be interested in listening to someone pour their heart out to Stephen Molyneux in the call-in show, for example, right? So I think that's where that's where the kind of libertarian angle and the dissident right, as I've mentioned already, if we're moving into the kind of the neo-reactionary stuff or the traditionalists, they need to talk about motherhood and how important it is, and how women have so much power and agency in motherhood, because that's where women's agency is really. It's with children, and it's with motherhood, and it's with creating a nurturing community. That is where their agency lies, and that's where they're going to thrive, and that's where they have the most potential. And so that is where it needs to go. If you're going to attract more women to the conversation, you can still talk about some of the key principles and concepts and the ideas about it, but just in that context, I think. And if anyone who is in a young man who's in the dissident right, who's lost all hope in ever having a successful relationship with a woman or about anything to do with for the future, but they just need to go and have a look at online homeschooling businesses and the women that basically spend all their time they homeschool their children, and they set up a small little business online selling resources to other women and doing videos about it. And like that, then you'll see that's where women thrive, and you'll see the free market, as it were, in action, because they are doing their own thing. They're creating their own little businesses, creating their own networks, and it's none of it is directly regulated by the government in a way that other industries may be, for example. And I think that they need to stop talking about, well, women just need to go, you get married young and you have your kids, and you're going to be more traditional and be trad or whatever, and you're just going to go over there and put a dress on and cook dinner for us, and that's whatever. And it's like, the only guys that can get away with talking to women like that are the chads, okay? Because women will go, oh well, he's a chad, so it's okay if he's a bit of an arsehole. But most other men cannot get away with being arseholes like that, and we all know that, right? And let's be real here, that most the guys that spend their time arguing all this kind of political theory online, they don't tend to be the chads. Let's just be honest. So you can't, they have to be aware of where their position is with women, and they have to just kind of market these ideas to women in a way that women understand, and women will be like, okay, well, my role is to influence the children basically, and look after the home, and maybe run a business, but the business is focused on the local level, right? And that's how the terms that you need to talk to women in. Even the most modern careerist woman will respond to that, I believe.
I would broadly agree with that, and I'd just like to thank you for your time. It's been very interesting and entertaining. Now I'd just like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. And please subscribe to us on Podbean on YouTube. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibetyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibetyshow.